Wow, I just finished interviewing Jennie Erin Smith for her brand new book, Valley of Forgetting, Alzheimer's Families and the Search for a Cure. Such an amazing book. You're not going to be able to put it down once you start reading it. And a really great interview. And what I love about this book is it's an intimate look behind the scenes for the actual people and their experience. And Jennie, for 7 years, interviewed the major players of the story. So you're definitely going to want to watch the interview and get this book. Read it or listen to it. I'm a big fan. Peace and plants. Jennie Erin Smith is an American science journalist and nonfiction author renowned for her in-depth reporting on medicine, biology, wildlife, natural history, and Latin America. Her work has been featured in prominent publications such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Times Literary Supplement, the New Yorker, and Undark. She divides her time between Florida and Colombia. Her first book was Stolen World, a tale of reptiles, smugglers, and skullduggery. And today I'm going to be covering her second book, which is called Valley of Forgetting, Alzheimer's Families and the Search for a Cure. It's a narrative that centers on a large Colombian family afflicted by a genetic mutation known as the Paisa mutation, which leads to early onset Alzheimer's disease. Smith relocated to Medellin, Colombia in 2018 to immerse herself in the community and research led by neurologist Dr. Francisco Lopera. The book chronicles the family's participation in a landmark drug trial and their contribution to Alzheimer's research over 4 decades. You're definitely going to want to read this, and you're going to want to watch my interview. We're in for a real treat today. We've got the author of this book, Valley of Forgetting, and amazing book. I just finished it. I've got Jennie Erin Smith with me, and wow, once I picked up the book, I couldn't stop reading it. It was so engaging, so personable, because we're working in the Alzheimer's field. You can read papers about genetics, and it's very clinical. It's very impersonal. What I love from cover to cover, it's personal. You tell the stories not just of the what I would call patients, but the people with Alzheimer's and their families, but also the researchers. And you basically, it sounds like for 7 years, you moved to Colombia to cover this story. And so I can tell. I mean, you've done your research behind it. I have so many questions for you, but I think the most important thing is, if you're interested in Alzheimer's, both from the scientific but a personal side, definitely pick up this book. So my first question is, how in the world did you end up in this field? Because I know you went to college at Colombia studying East Asian studies, and then you ended up in the country of Colombia on this topic. How in the world did you end up there?
I have been for many years a science reporter, just a freelance science reporter doing, I did a previous book on animal smuggling and animal smugglers and their connections to zoos and museums. And I've done a ton of sort of freelance science reporting. But I graduated Columbia University a million years ago. And at that time, I had majored in Japanese. And so I quickly jettisoned that life course after I graduated, and I got into journalism. I got into journalism because I was working at a Japanese newspaper. But I got sick of the sort of Japanese experience, and but I stuck with journalism, and I've worked all over, in Washington, in New York, and for years and years in Florida as an environmental reporter. at some point in the last decade or so, my husband and I decided that we were going to move to Latin America. We wanted to learn Spanish, and we wanted to pick up stories. And I wanted to pick up science stories from the region, and he wanted to pick up other types of stories. So in about 2012, late 2011, we moved to Medellin, Colombia, briefly to learn Spanish. We then came back to the United States, did other things, but I never forgot that experience. I learned pretty good Spanish. And I continued as a science and medical reporter for Medscape, and also for the New York Times, the New Yorker, all kinds of different publications. So I was watching 60 Minutes back in, I believe it was 2016, the fall of 2016, in Florida with a friend. And there was a show called, I believe it was called the Alzheimer's Laboratory. And it talked about a group of people, a giant extended family in Medellin, Colombia, which is exactly where I had studied Spanish, in Medellin, Colombia, who had a form of genetic early onset Alzheimer's that's caused by a genetic mutation that was unique to them. But what was really important about them is that there's families like this all over the world with mutations on the presenilin gene or the APP gene. These are two genes implicated in early onset Alzheimer's. But the number of members that they're likely to have is about 200. This Colombian family has 6,000 members. And as such, they were always of long interest to science because, of course, you can get statistical significance in a sample of 6,000
Right.
people.
It was a big Catholic family.
It was a
right?
giant. Well, when I say big Catholic family, by definition of Catholic, I mean there may be non-Catholic members, but yeah, the country is Catholic. So
Right.
they come from rural roots. This family, they don't all have the same last name. I mean, these are really extended kindreds. But they come from the same province of Colombia, which is actually a province that has Medellin as its capital. And that province is called Antioquia. People from Antioquia in Colombian slang are called Paisas. This genetic mutation that they have came to be known as the Paisa mutation. The family was studied for the better part of maybe 25 years by a Colombian neurologist named Dr. Lopera. And he did all kinds of interesting studies in them. And they were considered an interesting model for how Alzheimer's disease developed. And a lot of things were learned from them, including, how amyloid builds up in the brain from brain studies. He started a brain bank where people donated their brains, which was no easy task because, they're traditional rural people who would have been inclined to be skeptical about that type of thing. And so this charming and talented physician really was a leader, a research leader, but also sort of a figurehead for the families for the last, for 40 years until he died. Then what happened, and I think a number of people who follow Alzheimer's disease tend to know this story, that around 2008 to 2010, a new class of drugs kind of came onto the scene for Alzheimer's disease. They were experimental drugs that acted against what's considered, or the first protein to build up in the brain in Alzheimer's disease, which is amyloid beta, right? And so a group of experimental monoclonal antibodies was developed. And the question was, could you stop Alzheimer's before it starts if you clear the disease proteins from the brain in people who are still healthy, giving them perhaps a chance to remain healthy? So it was a lofty goal. And people said a clinical trial couldn't be done in Colombia, that it was too crazy, that it was too dangerous. And it was crazy. It was dangerous.
Well,
but
and it was even dangerous for you to cover this story.
I mean, generally, no. I mean,
Okay.
I lived in pretty yuppie area, and a lot of cappuccinos and croissants. But at times I did have to travel to some rural areas. But it wasn't so much that it was dangerous for me. It was dangerous for the researchers for all the years that they were working. And so they put this cohort together under very, very difficult circumstances. Colombia was basically at war in the late 90s and early 2000s, right? They had this research cohort together. They continued visiting the patients. They continued observing the patients. They conducted natural history studies to see how Alzheimer's develops, which had real relevance for Alzheimer's studies in other parts of the world. And finally, in 2013, they began testing anti-amyloid drugs in this population. So I stuck around from pretty much the year after I'd heard about this project on 60 Minutes, right? I showed up some 6 months later in Colombia trying to see if I could uh, talk them into letting me do a book. So I basically, a year after seeing that show, I moved to Colombia and began observing what ended up being the final phase of the clinical trial. And a lot more crazy things happened during that time. I thought I was coming in at the tail end of an interesting story, but actually I think I was coming into the beginning of an interesting story, and we could talk a little bit more about why.
Well, and I'm curious, how did you go from, how did you know it was the right time to write this book? Or because I think you covered about 7 years in this book.
I covered 7 years in person. The book itself starts
Sure.
in 1984 with the
Right.
first patient walking into the hospital, a farmer who was demented at 47, 49.
How did you know it was time to publish this?
Well, because nobody had done it as a book.
Interesting.
The story was well known. The 60 Minutes didn't go there for no reason. I mean, many journalists had been there before. Everybody from the BBC to Deutsche Welle, to all these different outlets had covered this study cohort because Dr. Lopera himself was an extremely charismatic man. And so I think it was interesting and fun for journalists to visit, to see the families, many of whom were caring for people with Alzheimer's disease in their homes, and to see and to talk to them, and to get to know Dr. Lopera. So he was a known quantity. This family was a known quantity. But in terms of how did I know it was the right time? I didn't.
Okay.
And I actually figured that I was coming in at the wrong time, that all the principal action had happened.
Right.
But then something happened in 2019. We can talk about it, but something happened in 2019 that really gave this a twist. So.
Right. I mean, I love what you've published. It's amazing. But how did you know to finish it when you did, as opposed to, and my next question is do you think there's going to be a part 2? I guess no one knows, but no.
I don't think so, but I'll tell you. So I got involved in this almost as soon as I heard about it. But I had assumed going into this that really the main action of this story had already passed. As when I got to Colombia, when I started really working with this group, it was already clear to me by 2018 that there was some concern in the air that this trial was going to fail, right? All other anti-amyloid drugs, there had been very high hopes that these were going to work in late onset Alzheimer's and early onset, and everybody was being tested. And this population was almost ideal to be tested.
And let's be clear, to my understanding, there have actually been dozens of different anti-amyloid drug studies out there.
Right. By the time this study used a drug called crenezumab that was never developed further after this. It was being tested in late onset Alzheimer's and it was being tested in early onset Alzheimer's. So when I came in, there was disappointment that maybe this drug wasn't working. There were sort of rumors that maybe this drug wasn't working. And I think the people who were day to day in the trial were sort of seeing people start to get sick on time, which was a really disheartening thing. Some people were on the study drugs, some people were on the placebo. So obviously some people were going to get sick. Right.
But the point is, I think that the people who were on the placebo or the study drug, they didn't know which one they were getting.
No, of course not. They didn't know, and neither did the staff. But they were just starting to see an awful lot of people start to get sick. And that was demoralizing for the patients, and it was demoralizing for the researchers. And there was this just general concern and murmuring that maybe this wasn't going to work. Also, the study drug the dose was real low. And as it turned out, it could increase. They had done safety studies that showed it could increase, but everybody was concerned that the patients were getting too low a dose so that there might not even be a readable result for this trial. And that pretty much set the tone for the clinical trial. More anti-amyloid drugs were failing. Crenezumab itself failed in trials of people with late onset Alzheimer's disease, who it was also being tested in the United States and Europe. And, there was just a general sort of somber mood about the whole thing. So the trial was scheduled to end in 2022. In 2019, there was a discovery of a Colombian woman. She was not in the clinical trial. She was 76 years old. And as it turned out, she had the Paisa mutation, but she had not gotten sick. And that was a really surprising case. And so when I said there was a twist toward the end of the trial in 2019, she was the twist. And that caused, first of all, restoked enthusiasm in the Colombia project because you have such large families that are getting sick. You also have outlier cases and all kinds of other things happening. You can see more when you have more people.
Of course. And
yeah. And so here's this amazing case. And as it turns out, there were more amazing cases. So there were people who had beat it. This mutation has what is called 100% penetrance, or at least it was believed to have 100% penetrance, which is very typical for genes that cause early onset Alzheimer's, i.e., there's not a lot you can do about this.
Right.
You're going to get sick. And yet,
if you have the gene.
If you have the gene, have the genes. And yet here's this lady cooking, doing her own errands, walking around, still hanging out, drinking with her girlfriends, maintaining her own home, her own independent home at 76 years of age. So that threw this same research cohort into focus one more time, not just because the drug trial, which in 2022, we had the sad result that it didn't work, but because of the hopeful cases that were also coming out of Colombia. And then there was this scramble to study them and to understand what they meant.
Right. And just to kind of muddy the waters, it turned out that the mutation she had was this ApoE3 Christchurch one.
Right. So I think that, this was all over the papers. This was all over the New York Times. It was published in Nature. The case was published in Nature in 2019. And there have been subsequent cases like it published in Colombia and in other places. The theory of this case was that the lady, her name was Illyria. I got to know her. I knew her before she died, and I relate that in the book. She had a crazy life story, crazy family story. She's a pretty crazy person. But yeah, that Illyria had not only the Paisa mutation gene, which is the bad gene, the deleterious gene, but she had a genetic mutation on ApoE4, which is a well-known, the best known and most common risk gene for late onset Alzheimer's, that they believed had the possibility of having stopped the activity of the Paisa mutation, or slowed the activity of the Paisa mutation gene. Now, this is still one case. The experimental results based on organoids, based on stem cells in mice, have shown many, many promising effects of this Christchurch genetic mutation, which was the name of the supposedly protective mutation that she had. But, the jury's still out on this until there are other human cases with the same profile as her profile. You can't rule out the idea that it might be a multigenic effect. But what the bottom line is, it certainly wasn't a lifestyle effect, because Illyria was a hard partying lady with a tough lifestyle. And, she didn't have anything you would call conventionally healthy or protective.
And that may be one reason why she got cancer at the end.
Well, so the other part of the story is that they had expected to be studying this star patient Illyria for many, many years, and had sent her to Boston. The Columbia research team has a sort of an arm at Harvard, and they send people for advanced imaging all the time to their colleagues at Harvard, who are also Colombian expats, or have migrated to the United States. And they were expecting to be doing all kinds of work with her alive. But during the pandemic, she she was diagnosed with melanoma, a metastatic melanoma, and she really didn't have much access to medical care, and she died. And the research group was able to harvest her brain. I wrote a piece in the New York Times about that event and what, the autopsy of her brain and what was hoped to be learned from her brain. And there were some important insights from her brain. The key one being, and they knew this from her when she was alive, but the key insight was that she had a ton of amyloid beta in her brain, a ton, right? Amyloid beta protein. It was just, her brain was full of plaques.
Right, which you would expect with the original mutation.
Right, the mutation causes an overload of amyloid in the brain. But then the question is, does that cause Alzheimer's disease? Because the amyloid alone did not give her symptoms. She had very little of the second protein seen, or second most famous protein seen in Alzheimer's, which is tau protein, which is the, what tau is. It's the tangled neurofibrils. And she had very little of that, or what she had of it was restricted to sort of one area in the back of her head. So it seems as though whatever protective factors, the Christchurch mutation, whatever protective factors she had, restricted the growth of tau in her brain. And that tau, not having tau in your brain is kind of means you won't have symptoms in Alzheimer's disease. So tau is more closely correlated
Right.
with the onset.
You don't get the tau tangles.
Right.
But the frustrating thing with Alzheimer's is none of this is absolute. So not everyone who gets a lot of amyloid in their brain will get Alzheimer's, just like similarly, not everyone who has a lot of tau tangles will end up with Alzheimer's. So it's murky. And I think you one of the people you interviewed said, like, I've been working in this field for 20 years and I still don't understand it.
Yeah. And that person was a brain pathologist. And I've heard, there's some really interesting brain pathologists out there in the Alzheimer's field. And they are some of the most radical people when it comes to, making assertions about Alzheimer's disease. Because what they see a lot of times is sort of mixed pathology. Lewy bodies in Alzheimer's, people diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, including these genetic cases, or, just this sort of mixed brain pathology that doesn't really fit in any neat box. And that's something that's reported by brain pathologists. And they're some of the most interesting people, I think, working in Alzheimer's. As far as tau, though, you said something that I would challenge a little bit, which is that, like, some people have lots of tau and no symptoms. There are people like that, but generally speaking, like, if you've got tau, you've got problems.
Agreed. But again, it's not a linear 100% correlation. So, and that's what we would love. We'd love this to be Alzheimer's to be a simple disease. That's not what I found. What I found is you're normally dealing between 30 and 200 root causes. And now the genetics may be a little bit different, but even in the genetics, in the example you're giving, I find that people could have some genes that are working against them and actually some that are protective. So it's not that you can just check one gene and then everything about your risk of Alzheimer's. It's not that simple.
Right. And the key right. And that's why it's hard for me to get too excited about blood tests, right? That, show, early on whether you have an XY, protein, because it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that you'll develop Alzheimer's pathology, although I can't say that for sure. But yeah, what I did want to say about the resilience cases, like Illyria's case, is that, and this resilience cases have been documented before and since Illyria. But I think that famous case really galvanized the field toward a different type of approach, looking at what mechanisms might be protective. How can we mimic those mechanisms, right? First, identifying them is nothing easy, right? It's not simple. It's not easy, especially when you have these really rare cases that aren't really replicated. But it really, I thought, sort of turned the field's head a little bit. And I think that regardless of, what the precise mechanism is with Illyria and with some of these other resilience cases, like the very existence of this type of genetic resilience against a gene that's supposed to be 100% penetrant, I think is something really, really important. And that's from Colombia.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it also raises to my point that sometimes it's complicated. So for example, the Christchurch mutation may protect you by decreasing the amount of tau, but it also increases your cholesterol level, which may not be a good thing in some cases. So
yes, Illyria had high cholesterol. That was, a finding that was of great interest to the researchers, to find that she'd been on statins.
Wow. That is fascinating. So one question that I couldn't tease out of, reading the book, and I didn't delve into the papers, but what other treatments were these people getting if any, in addition to, I mean, they were, many of them were getting medical care, but beyond access to medical care, were they getting other supplements or things like that?
I mean, okay, so that's a really interesting question because you're dealing with the Colombian context, right? So you're dealing with rural people, uh, or people who have rural roots and rural ways, even if they live in the city. So a lot of people in this Colombian cohort would have turned at some point or another to herbalists uh, seeking treatments. Now, I have never heard of success from an herbalist herbalists are part of the fabric of life in Latin America. And they do have effective effective treatments for lots of stuff. But I'm not sure that anyone could report anything that staved off an incipient dementia. That said, if they did have it, no one was studying it, right? I can assure you that, because I think the medical profession in Colombia frowns a bit upon these treatments. So I doubt they would have been carefully investigated.
So you're saying the medical doctors in Colombia frown upon the herbalists in Colombia?
A
A
little
little bit,
bit.
okay.
Yeah. I mean, they understand that people are going to take herbal remedies. In fact, that was a really key question at the beginning of the clinical trial because the collaborators in the United States, all the money came from the United States for this clinical trial and from the drug company Roche, which is Swiss. And when they were, weeding people out to join this clinical trial, one of the key questions was, what herbs are you taking? And I don't know if that was an exclusion criteria for the trial, but I do know that it was of great interest to the trial sponsors, what people were taking.
Fascinating. And another question I had while I was reading the book was, I've seen some studies saying that presenilin one, it puts you at higher risk or it's worse if you eat a high fat diet. Any idea what the diet was like for these people?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Again, this has not been studied in this cohort, but there's another research group. So there's like two major research groups, both studying genetic early onset Alzheimer's cohorts. One of them is out of the University of Washington. They're called Diane, and they have an important Alzheimer's Research Center, and they put together cohorts with people with presenilin, APP mutations, the early onset mutations from all over the world. And then there's sort of the Colombian cohort, which is so big that it kind of has its own, it's its own thing. I don't believe in the Colombian cohort that diet has been systematically studied. The Colombian diet is, people are not obese because they're really active generally. I mean, you see overweight people, especially by a certain age, but obesity is very, very rare in the Colombian population in general. People do consume a lot of sugar. It's a sugar producing country. They make a lot of their own soft drinks. Fried foods are common. Pork is a huge staple of the diet, so
Right.
yeah.
And this is true even in the rural areas that you were
More
describing.
so. Yeah,
More
maybe
so.
more so. I mean,
Okay.
again, they get so much exercise, it almost doesn't matter. They are really, really, they're people who are very, they work hard, right? They're farmers. They eat a lot and they work hard. And I wouldn't imagine that there's a ton of additives or anything in the kinds of foods that they eat. But this issue has not been systematically studied in this population. However, the Diane researchers, and I don't think they've published this yet, they have been doing some very interesting work in early onset Alzheimer's, which was, I think, widely held to be you couldn't do a thing about it if you were going to get it. You couldn't do anything to offset your age of onset. It was going to be 45 or 47, whatever it was going to be, was determined by your genetic makeup. I think they have shown, or they're starting to show, or they're starting to see that you can indeed take some measures, which would be a great relief to this Colombian population to know. And I did meet a young man. He's not in the book. There's a really moving interview that I had with him both his parents were affected, right? By the Paisa mutation, because cousin marriage is actually not unusual in this group of people. It's rural Latin America, right? Big families.
But it's one way that the gene stays around. If
It doesn't help, right?
Yeah.
So he had the possibility of having inherited it, a double wham. He could have gotten it from both sides. He might have been homozygote, right, for the mutation, which is a terrible situation. And I think they have done some studies that showed that people who do have two copies of it, who are unfortunate enough to have that genetic combo, do get sick really early, and in even worse course of illness. Well, this young man was kind of amazing. I mean, he decided with his wife that they weren't going to eat sugar. There was no sugar in the house. He did an hour of hard exercise a day. He actually looked into psychotropic medications. He followed the science. He was an English speaker. So there were really active patients who were hell-bent on doing what they could to stave this off. There hasn't been a lot of research in this population on what they might do.
Fascinating. One whole topic that you talk about in the book, you don't really share your opinion, which is fine, but kind of the ethics of all this, that here we have, American or Western company putting millions of dollars into research in a third world country, where even if the drugs had been successful, if the trials had been successful, the people are not promised access to this drug for more than maybe a year or two after the study's over.
Yeah, no, that was something that really bothered me even going into this. That drug companies don't like to promise to deliver study drugs or experimental agents beyond the course of a study. And one of the reasons they don't like to do is they can't guarantee that whatever drug this is going to pass regulatory approval in any country, or the country that they're studying the drug in. So there's always that sort of uncertainty. But I do believe that the people who were taking these drugs, these experimental drugs, who were committing 8 years of their lives to doing this study and seeing it through to completion, and like 95% of them completed the trial, which is amazing. But I do believe that they had hope that if it worked, they would get it. And I looked all over for a mechanism for that. I talked to Roche executives. I talked to the doctors. I talked to the trial sponsors. And nobody really had like a firm answer on that. And I realized that this is just part of the clinical trials world, which doesn't mean that it's not controversial. It is controversial enough that in the last year, Brazil passed a law saying that an experimental drug used on the Brazilian population has to continue to be given to people, if it works, until such time as it's available in the public health system of Brazil. That's pretty radical. The pharmaceutical companies fought it, but I think the Brazilian government has prevailed on that. We'll see how that works. But none of that was in place in Colombia, so there were no such guarantees. So that concerned me.
Sure. Yeah, and I see that in trials in the United States. So it's not, it's troubling, definitely.
Yeah, I don't know, I don't know what, I think it's an issue that should be revisited, and I think, again, the patients who were in this clinical trial, there was something I probably should have mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, is that unlike most patients in clinical trials of an anti-Alzheimer's therapy, they were not aware whether they were mutation carriers or not. Both mutation carriers and non-mutation carriers were recruited into the trial. And the ostensible reason for that, or the reason for that, was that it wasn't the convention in this part of the world to tell patients whether they had the mutation. It was believed that people would kill themselves. It was believed that people would become depressed, and it was believed that they didn't wish to know. That was another thing I was keen to investigate from the beginning was is that true? Did people wish to know or not? And I found that a lot of the times it was generational. The younger people did tend to wish to know. Their more traditional and religious parents might not have wished to know. But at any rate, people were kept in this trial 8 years who were not mutation carriers. All of those people received placebo.
Wow.
Yeah. That's very unusual. And that would not happen in the United States because nobody in the United States would give 8 years of their lives. And there were major restrictions on what you could do. You could not have a baby. You could not smoke pot. There were lots of different things. You couldn't move away. So there were a lot of restrictions on people's lives. And this is going in without even knowing if you're carrying the mutation or not. So I think there were a lot of things that could be done in Colombia and were done in Colombia that might not have been kosher, or kosher is the wrong word, but not customary.
What was your opinion? It sounded like there were several times in the book where the Colombian researchers who had put, some of them, decades into this field, when papers got published using the data and the population that they had worked on for decades, they didn't get primary credit for it.
Yeah, that only happened once, in fairness to the trial sponsors. So I think one of the key things that this book shows is what it takes to be a successful investigator in a developing country. A developing country is kind of a euphemism for what Colombia was at that time. I mean, it has a lot of infrastructure, but it was essentially a country in civil war, right? And my main protagonist of this book, who's Dr. Lopera, had been kidnapped. Other members of his team had been kidnapped. Families were constantly threatened by paramilitary forces or guerrilla forces. And so it wasn't necessarily improper that the trial sponsors, when they first published the trial protocol, I think it was in the journal Alzheimer's and Dementia, it would have put themselves in the top positions as first author and last author. But the reason it wasn't improper. They were the trialists, right? But it didn't reflect what it had taken Dr. Lopera in terms of risk and sacrifice to bring that cohort together. And that was why it was objectionable. That said, there was a kerfuffle about it, right? The Colombian team was mad. There was a kerfuffle. And, the sponsors sort of acknowledged that maybe that wasn't the best way to do it. And they did it differently the next time.
Fascinating. So you said you don't think there's going to be a part 2. What makes you say that?
I believe that this research effort, to some degree, reflected the will and talent of one man. And when I say talent, I don't even think Dr. Lopera was necessarily the most brilliant scientist in this group. I think what he was a boss. He was always being accused by both the patients and his colleagues of being patriarchal, being too traditional, not telling the members of his cohort whether they had the mutation or not. That's like classic old school, doctor stuff, right? That's been abandoned for good reason. We're not telling mom she has cancer. Are you kidding me? But he maintains some of those traditions, and he ruled with an iron fist. And what was amazing about Dr. Lopera, and he was charming personally, but what was amazing about Dr. Lopera is he's doing all this research out of a Latin American public university. Every 6 months at the University of Antioquia, which was his institution, there was some sort of strike. While I was there, even, there would be you'd smell explosives from some other corner of the campus. The med school and the med facilities were sort of spared all the politics, but there were strikes, there were violent things happen, et cetera, et cetera. So he was able to somehow run this out of that type of institution, cutting through bureaucracy with a sword. And he just had a real talent for getting what he wanted. And I don't see that type of leadership in his absence. That's not to say there aren't extremely talented and well-placed researchers working with this Colombian cohort and Colombia data. There are. But sometimes it takes one person to sort of bring it all together and hold it together.
That makes perfect sense. So one thing you mentioned towards the end of the book is that the the next generation has doesn't trust, doesn't have the same level of trust that the previous generation did. Probably because, hey, they saw their parents or grandparents went through this study, and the results were not good.
Yeah, you nailed it. I mean, that's exactly what happened. So I had this assumption going in that, so just generally speaking, in this cohort of 6,000 people, in 1995, the education level was second grade or fifth grade. I don't remember. I think it was like second grade, right? By, 10 years from then, it was like fifth grade was the average. And then now it's about ninth grade. There's a big difference between second grade and ninth grade, right? I mean, so mom and dad, or couldn't were on the farm. There was no school. They could only get a couple grades of school. They were only marginally literate. And most of their kids are urban, have much more education. So I made the wrong assumption that with more education, you'd be more curious and want more to do with science and want to support science more. And that was not the case. The younger people had become disillusioned with the research. And now there are trials ongoing. I mean, they're still doing clinical trials, lots of clinical trials in this large population. But I question how they're going to recruit, 20 and 25-year-olds who are going to be recruited to see if administering certain types of anti-amyloid drugs really early in life will have an effect. So I wonder if they can really get them, because I think people have become cynical.
Fascinating. And one of the other dramas in the book is these clinical trials of the amyloid drugs. Like, now the trial didn't work, and it's like, oh, we're going to go back and look at a subgroup. It worked there, so we can go ahead with the study. So yes, it's fascinating how there are details here. It's not straightforward. It works or it doesn't work. Yeah.
Right. And that was unfortunately the result of the trial in Colombia, that, the statistics were sort of bending in the right direction. But there were a lot of interruptions to the trial. There was a dose change. There were regulatory issues all throughout, because the regulatory agency in Colombia is sort of notoriously sluggish. So it may have been that cost it a readable result. That said, the numbers were sort of trending in the right direction. So I think, maybe there is some intellectual basis for using this class of anti-amyloid drugs in this population. That said, the trend now is to go younger and younger, and the drugs are not without side effects. We know that they have considerable side effects. So people will have to also take that into consideration,
Right.
as they decide
Right.
whether to do
Right.
this.
The drug you mentioned in the book, I think like up to 10% of people would either get brain bleeds or brain swelling.
Well, that wasn't the study drug that was used on the Colombians. Actually, that drug had remarkably few serious adverse events, but the class of drugs has problems. And so that's just a question. I mean, it's one thing to do it to a 40-year-old who could get sick in 5 years, but to a 25-year-old, who's looking at least 20 years before the first hint of a symptom. So that's a consideration. But yeah, so I think, the research in Colombia is definitely getting heavier and heavier toward drug trials rather than other things.
Yeah, you covered in the book what happened during COVID a little bit. Did you see many other infectious diseases while you were down in Colombia? I'm just curious.
Just in general, well, there's all kinds of infectious diseases in Colombia. There's I don't know if you say lesh or leishmaniasis.
Oh yeah, that parasite, sure.
That nasty parasite is,
Yes.
unfortunately, dengue is huge. I don't know if that counts. Does dengue count as infectious? It's vector-borne.
Sure.
Dengue is huge. Yeah, there's a lot of infectious disease. I mean, are you insinuating? In fact, if you're insinuating an Alzheimer's connection, there has been some research done on that by the Colombian group on those brains. I don't know that it made any great splash. It was probably published in Spanish. But the research, I think, is out there in terms of what pathogens were found in brains. That said, like, you would really have to be pretty out there to say that there's an infectious cause. I mean,
No, I don't think it's
infection
out
could
there.
be
Let me give you two examples. I understand this population. Yes, there is a gene that's causing early Alzheimer's. But again, when I analyze at least the patients I'm seeing, and I know most of them don't have early Alzheimer's genes. But what I'm saying in my population and in other studies that are published, there are parasites like Toxoplasmosis gondii, the parasite that will lodge in parts of the brain, including the temporal lobes, that has been associated with development of Alzheimer's. That's number one. Number two, there are studies. This doesn't happen anymore, but it used to be um, before the 1980s. They for people with dwarfism who needed growth hormone, they would actually extract growth hormone from cadavers, and so in that population, there are patients who got early Alzheimer's in their or as early in their 30s. So there definitely is a suggestion that there could be infectious agents. But to me, this is all really fascinating because I remember back to when I was studying biochemistry at Harvard in the 1980s, and they were talking about this entity that causes disease called prions. Well, it turns out that prions include amyloid and tau protein. Those are both prions. So, and I remember in the 1980s, they talked about all these different theories of what really prions, how they cause disease, and they're really hard to study. But I would say there hasn't been that much advancement. There's this big question, but there's definitely an association between both amyloid and tau, and Alzheimer's. And I'll put forth both amyloid and tau proteins are prions. So
I've heard the phrase prion-like in relation to tauopathies, which are a large group of diseases that include frontotemporal dementia, CTE, but but just to complete that thought on infections in Colombia, I mean, I would never agree that you could call them causative in this context when you have such a clear-cut culprit.
right
But there
in
are
this
many things,
population, sure.
right? But one of the things that the resilience cases have shown, right? Cases like Mrs. Illyria, right? One of the things that they've shown is that there's a lot of variability in age of onset that's not entirely accounted for, right? Now, there are genetic factors, but there could be other factors. And I think that space was sort of ignored, right? You have this kind of like, it can be almost a 10-year window or something, a range of ages of onset. You're still getting Alzheimer's very, very young, abnormally young. You have the genetic trigger, right? Because you're a carrier of the mutation, so it's going to get you sooner or later. But there's still like wiggle room in like a 10-year window there. And I think that's something that they've been more focused on since those resilience cases, because before, I think the inclination was to lop the outliers off the analysis, right? That it was better to have a nice tight sort of window and dismiss any real outlying cases. And all of a sudden, in 2019, I said there was a twist. Everything turned around to focus on people who were outliers and what was causing that. And of course, there's outliers in the opposite direction, right? People who would get it really young. But that's usually genetic factors that are suspected, like a double dose, homozygosity or something like that. But yeah, I think there's wiggle room, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I think all of these ideas, could potentially be contributing.
Yeah, so I understand now why you don't think there'll necessarily be a part two. Have you decided what the next project is going to be for you?
No.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, no, I have not. I think right now I'm really trying to get the word out about this story, because I mean, it's not just a medical story. It doesn't end with the papers. It doesn't end with the findings. I mean, this is a story that went back in, and we didn't talk about them at all. But I think one of the unique aspects of the book is that it gets into people's lives. So all the journalism, and when I say lives, I'm talking lives of the researchers and their personal decisions and their personalities and their experiences, but also the families in a really in-depth way. And one thing I think, if I may brag, um, one thing that I accomplished is, like, you talk in research about a cross-sectional study, right? A slice in time where you look at something. Basically, all reporting, all journalism that's been done to date on these families looked at them at a slice in time and interviewed them and said, how do you feel about your disease or your family's disease? What do you think? And they'll say something, and that gets recorded, and that makes the record, and that's the register of this. But it's quite different to follow somebody over a multi-year period to see how their ideas and attitudes change, how they change their mind about a genetic test, how they want to do it, then don't want to do it, change their mind about parenthood. They want to go for it. They don't want to go for it, all within the spectrum of the disease. So what I was able to see is, over like a longer arc of time, how people live with this disease, how people live with the specter of disease, and how people live with caretaking responsibilities and all the other things. That, I think, is what makes it unique. And I think anybody who's ever been a caregiver will relate to these experiences. But these are caregivers who are young. They're often in their 20s, right? Mom is 45 and she's sick. And in these families, by the way, people don't have the numbers of kids that they used to have to get to 6,000. Like, the reason the family got to be 6,000 is because people had 20 kids 100 years ago, or even up until maybe the 1950s, they had 20 kids. 15 and 20 kids was not unusual at all. Now it's quite unusual. But anyway, to make a long story short, this captures a much greater arc of human behavior in a region where everyone has all the caretaking responsibilities that people like in the United States have to an Alzheimer's patient, but nobody has the resources. And people are quite a bit younger. So this shifts the window in which Alzheimer's disease is occurring. It shifts the lens. And I think that's why, it would be of interest.
Fascinating. So what was your biggest surprise over the last 7 years working on this story?
Illyria. I mean, a lot of things can go wrong in 7 years, right? And that's one of the miracles of this book, is that I actually got it out, because the clinical trial could have been canceled. COVID screwed up clinical trials all over the world. It could have been quite possible. We had no readable result. Dr. Lopera passed away in 2024. He could have passed away sooner, but without even seeing the results of, the clinical trial, which to some degree reflected his life's work, right? It's the fruit of, it's the next step in a whole huge career. A lot of awful things could have happened, and yet somehow none of that happened until then. It's really sad that he had to die, because he was really in some ways at the peak of his powers, and certainly at the peak of his fame in the Alzheimer's world. And he was sort of enjoying that, sort of being a major figure on the global Alzheimer's scene, whereas before the clinical trial, he was sort of that Colombian guy, he was somebody on the margins, right? And now, because his disciples had achieved a lot of scientific fame in U.S. and European universities, and he had achieved his own fame, and the Colombian project was finally kind of giving him the respect and accolades that he deserved. Unfortunately, he did pass away. But, had he passed away earlier, we would never have known the outcome of this. Or somebody might have, I guess the trial would have continued, but it would have been very different for him not to have seen it through.
Sure. And you mentioned in the book there was someone who's kind of the heir apparent, but yeah.
Yes, but he's quite different. So when Dr. Francisco Lopera passed away, in 2024, in September of 2024, he, essentially gave the research group over to a young doctor who was his sort of right-hand man for years and years. And so it sort of remains to be seen where he'll take this research group, but they couldn't be more different. Dr. Lopera is a charming, folksy country man who came from the country, and he was really able to speak the language of his patients. And his successor is a basic doctor. I mean, he's comes from sort of an academic, it's different. It's different. So we'll see where that goes.
That's awesome. So how would you summarize this book? I mean, basically what it does is it not only it describes early genetic disease, it also tells you the story of many of the different people, families, researchers.
I would say that it describes something that is very difficult to see. I would call the book intimate. And the reason it's intimate is because I was the cover, I'm sure like just holding a cover up, can't really see it. But the cover is the family in their home, at home. That's how the researchers saw the families, right? They went to their homes. That home that's on the cover is deep in the countryside. They went to their homes. They experienced the disease in people's homes. And so I was in many of those homes. And so I really got to know the families really, really well and understand how they lived with this. And the other thing is, I was equally in the clinic in a way that you could never, ever get away with in the United States, it's all for better or for worse, right? Because of privacy laws and stuff. So I was able, with the patient's permission, I was able to attend autopsies. I was able to attend many autopsies, many discussions in consulting rooms. I was privy to a lot of things. So I would say this is a very intimate look at a clinical trial, at the difficulties of making the right call in research, trial and error, just in the scientific process. Everybody who's involved in this wants to cure Alzheimer's, right? So, regardless of, if there's a bit of ego here, if there's a bad decision there, or an inopportune thing, a bit of selfishness over here, maybe a little greed over there, everybody still wants to cure Alzheimer's, right? And the families also want a cure for Alzheimer's. So I think ultimately they're moving in the same direction, with some bumps. And I think I showed that, nobody before me or likely after me.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's probably why I couldn't put it down. I mean, it was like, what? But I guess that's a warning. Like, well, once you start reading this, you're not going to stop. So it's available. It's available in printed form. It's also available in audio.
The audio is wonderful. A really wonderful narrator, I think, is doing the audio. So I think it's very pleasant to listen to. She pronounces the Spanish perfectly because she's a Mexican-American woman. So yeah, it's really nice.
Beautiful. And Jennie, if someone wants to reach out to you, are you on social media and how
I'm
can
on
they reach you?
Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn. Yes, of
Okay.
course, they can reach out to me. And if it's regarding the book, yeah, of course, yeah, for any reason.
Awesome. Well,
All right.
again, Jennie, thank you so much for your time.
No, it was my pleasure. It was fun.
And congratulations. And
Thank you.
Wow.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks.